Imagine a world where one era follows another like the pages of an ancient book. At the end of the 18th century, when the old order was crumbling and the new was just taking shape, a man appeared on the European stage whose name is forever etched in history. But how exactly did this man, emerging from the shadows of a raging revolution, rise from humble officer to ruler of the continent? And what forces drove him as he redrew the map of Europe, leaving a trail of change and conquest in his wake? Let's delve into this era to understand how empires were born and how a genius tempered by adversity shaped the course of history. The beginning of this remarkable journey lies in the very heart of the French Revolution, a time of profound upheaval and hope. It was in this turbulent current of events, where every day brought new challenges, that the path of one of history's most remarkable military leaders and statesmen began, Napoleon Bonaparte. His rise was not simply a series of accidents, but the logical consequence of his exceptional abilities, ambition, and ability to navigate the chaos of change. Born on the island of Corsica in 1769, the young Napoleon displayed a keen intellect and boundless energy from an early age. His childhood coincided with the island's early independence and subsequent annexation to France. This had a significant impact on his development, giving him a unique, somewhat detached perspective on events unfolding on the mainland. After receiving his military education in France, he plunged headlong into the whirlwind of revolutionary events. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, became a catalyst for many talents, and Napoleon was no exception. He quickly distinguished himself in the army, demonstrating not only tactical acumen, but also an ability to inspire soldiers. His early successes, particularly during the siege of Toulon in 1793, brought him to the attention of the military. This was the first significant milestone that demonstrated his potential as a military leader. As the revolution gained momentum, political regimes in France also changed. After the Jacobin Terror and the Directory, the country desperately needed a strong hand capable of restoring order and ensuring stability. It was at this moment that Napoleon Bonaparte found himself in the right place at the right time, possessing the necessary qualities to meet these challenges. His true talent as a commander was fully revealed during the Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797. Leading an army that was poorly equipped and demoralized, Napoleon quickly achieved a series of brilliant victories over the Austrian and Sardinian forces. His swift maneuvers, surprise attacks, and skill at exploiting enemy weaknesses allowed him to conquer northern Italy and negotiate a peace favorable to France. This campaign not only brought him fame and recognition, but also laid the foundation for his reputation as an invincible commander. The next step in his ambitious career was the Egyptian expedition, which began in 1798. The goal of this campaign was not only to weaken Britain's position in India, but also to expand Napoleon's influence and discover new horizons. The expedition had a dual character. On the one hand, it was a military operation, and on the other, a scientific expedition, bringing together numerous scientists and explorers who made significant contributions to the study of Egypt. Despite several military successes, such as the Battle of the Pyramids, the expedition as a whole failed to achieve its strategic goals due to the defeat of the French fleet at the Battle of Aboukir. Nevertheless, it remains one of the most discussed chapters in Napoleon's biography, demonstrating his indefatigable ambition and desire for greatness. Upon returning from Egypt, Napoleon found the political situation in France even more unstable. The Directory was losing the people's trust, and the country once again found itself on the brink of crisis. Using his authority and popularity, Napoleon organized a coup d'état, known as the Coup of 18th Brumaire, November 9, 1799. This coup overthrew the Directory, and a new government, the Consulate, came to power. Napoleon became first consul, effectively concentrating all power in his hands. The consulate period was a time of profound reforms and the restoration of order in France. Napoleon distinguished himself not only as a military leader, but also as an outstanding administrator and legislator. Public administration was reorganized. The Bank of France was established, and the financial system was stabilized. Of particular significance was the adoption of the Civil Code, known as the Napoleonic Code, which systematized French law and had a profound influence on the legislation of many countries around the world. These reforms laid the foundations of the modern French state and strengthened Napoleon's position as a leader. However, Napoleon's quest for power was not limited to his role as first consul. In 1804, seeking to strengthen his legitimacy and establish a dynasty, he proclaimed himself Emperor of the French. This act symbolized the transition from a revolutionary republic to an empire and marked the beginning of a new era. Napoleon's coronation, held in Notre Dame Cathedral, was a grand event designed to demonstrate the grandeur and power of the new France. The creation of the French Empire became the starting point for a series of massive military campaigns that forever changed the political map of Europe. Napoleon, now emperor, sought to dominate the continent, which inevitably led to conflicts with other European powers. One of the most striking chapters in the history of the Napoleonic Wars was the Battle of Austerlitz, which took place on December 2, 1805. Also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, this battle marked the pinnacle of Napoleon's military glory. His army, superior in tactics and strategy, achieved a crushing victory over the combined forces of Russia and Austria. Skillful exploitation of the terrain, brilliant maneuvers, and the determination of the French troops enabled Napoleon to achieve a triumph that is still studied in military academies around the world. After Austerlitz, Napoleon continued to redraw the map of Europe. He dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for over 1,000 years, and created the Confederation of the Rhine, uniting several German states under his protectorate. This event marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, setting in motion the process of future German unification. In 1806, Napoleon entered the war with Prussia, which sought to maintain its influence in German lands. The Battle of Jena-Auerstadt, fought on October 14, 1806, ended in the complete defeat of the Prussian army. Napoleon demonstrated his superiority by defeating the Prussians in 2 simultaneous battles, leading to the occupation of Berlin and a significant weakening of Prussia. In an attempt to finally crush Great Britain, Napoleon imposed the Continental Blockade, prohibiting European countries from trading with England. This economic war, which began in 1806, had far-reaching consequences. While the blockade damaged the British economy, it also fueled discontent among Napoleon's allies and led to the development of smuggling, which undermined the blockade's effectiveness. The most difficult and grueling conflict for Napoleon was the Spanish Wars, which began in 1808. Napoleon's attempt to place his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne led to a protracted and bloody guerrilla war. The Spanish, supported by British troops, put up fierce resistance. Imagine an island bathed in Mediterranean sunshine, where the air is filled with the scent of herbs and a salty breeze. This is Corsica, the birthplace of a man whose name is forever etched in history, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born in 1769 to an ancient but not particularly wealthy noble family. His childhood was spent surrounded by the sounds of Italian, as the Corsican language of the time was closely related to it. Little Napoleon was a boy with a fiery spirit and a keen mind, fond of military games and dreams of great achievements. Fate decreed that the young Bonaparte would have the opportunity to study at French military schools. First it was Brienne, then the prestigious Paris Military Academy. For the young Corsican, whose roots were deeply tied to his native island, France initially seemed foreign. He felt somewhat lonely, but he studied diligently, excelling particularly in mathematics and history. Imagine those classrooms where future officers studied tactics, fortification, and artillery. Daily life at the academy was strict and regimented, but it was here that the foundations for future victories were laid. 1789 was a turning point not only for France, but also for the young Napoleon. The revolution that swept the country opened the door to those with talent and ambition, regardless of their origins. Bonaparte, then an artillery officer, found himself at the very center of these turbulent events. He returned to Corsica, where he actively participated in political life, supporting the Jacobins. However, due to the intensification of internal conflicts on the island, he was forced to seek refuge again on mainland France. It was during this period, amidst the whirlwind of revolutionary change, that Napoleon began his rapid rise. His talent as a commander was fully revealed during the siege of Toulon in 1793. The city was occupied by royalist forces supported by the British Navy. The young Bonaparte, commanding the artillery, devised a brilliant plan that enabled the revolutionary troops to recapture the city. This victory brought him not only fame, but also the rank of brigadier general at the age of just 24. After Toulon, Napoleon continued his service, participating in the suppression of the Royalist revolt in Paris in 1795. His decisiveness and composure at a critical moment helped save the young Directory government. These events strengthened his position and paved the way for new, more significant appointments. He began to attract the attention of influential politicians who saw him as a man capable of bringing order and stability to turmoil-torn France. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of the Army of Italy. This was a challenge he embraced with characteristic energy. The Italian campaign became his first major independent military success. His goal was to defeat the Austrian forces and their allies on Italian soil. Facing superior enemy forces, Napoleon demonstrated incredible mobility, tactical cunning, and an ability to inspire his soldiers. He won a series of brilliant victories at Mondovì, Lodi, Arcola, and Rivoli. His armies advanced rapidly across Italy, liberating cities and concluding treaties favorable to France. French soldiers, weary from years of war, saw in Napoleon a leader capable of leading them to glory and plunder. His orders were clear, his strategy innovative. He knew how to exploit the local population, gain information, and act faster than his opponents. The Italian campaign not only brought military success to France, but also significantly replenished its treasury through indemnities and the confiscation of art. Napoleon proved himself not only as a military leader, but also as a skilled diplomat, skilled in negotiation and achieving his goals. In 1797, after the signing of the Peace of Campo Formio, he returned to France as a national hero. His name became a symbol of victory and power. However, Napoleon's ambitions extended beyond Italy. He saw himself not only as a military leader, but also as a statesman, capable of changing the course of European history. In 1798, the Directory, fearing Bonaparte's growing influence, sent him to Egypt. The expedition's purpose was twofold: to undermine British influence in India, and perhaps to find new avenues for French expansion. The Egyptian expedition was a grand undertaking, full of surprises. Along with the army, hundreds of scientists, artists, and engineers were on board the ships. Their mission was to explore the ancient civilization, collect artifacts, and study the flora and fauna. It was a true scientific voyage, which later led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the birth of Egyptology. Napoleon's army landed in Egypt and defeated the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids. But the naval battle of Abu Qir, where the British fleet under Admiral Nelson destroyed the French squadron, left the army in an extremely vulnerable position. The French were cut off from supplies and forced to wage war in harsh desert conditions, facing local resistance and disease. Despite military difficulties, the scientific portion of the expedition continued. Scientists collected invaluable information about ancient monuments, hieroglyphs, and the climate. Napoleon himself, a man of broad interests, devoted attention to scientific research, understanding its importance for France's prestige. However, the political situation at home was becoming increasingly unstable. The Directory was losing its authority, and the country needed a strong man. Upon learning of the crisis of power in France, Napoleon decided to return. Leaving his army in Egypt under the command of General Kleber, he secretly departed for his homeland in 1799. His return was greeted with hope and jubilation. The people longed for change, and many saw Napoleon as a savior. Arriving in Paris, Bonaparte, along with a group of like-minded individuals, including his brother Lucien, organized a coup d'etat. On November 9, 1799, 18th Brumaire, New Style, they dispersed the Council of 500 and the Council of Elders, effectively ending the Directory. This coup marked the beginning of a new era, the consulate. A new form of government was created, the consulate, headed by 3 consuls. Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul, wielding virtually unlimited power. He immediately embarked on reforms, seeking to strengthen the state and stabilize the country after the turbulent years of the Revolution. Financial reform was carried out. The Bank of France was founded, and a concordat with the Pope was concluded, restoring relations with the Catholic Church. Of particular significance was the development of the Civil Code, known as the Napoleonic Code. This set of laws, adopted in 1802, enshrined many of the Revolution's achievements, such as equality before the law, property rights, and freedom of conscience. The Napoleonic Code had a profound influence on the legislation of many countries, and remains in force to this day. During his consulate, Napoleon not only carried out domestic reforms, but also continued military operations. He defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo in 1801, strengthening his authority and leading to peace treaties. Gradually, his power became increasingly absolute. In 1802, he was proclaimed consul for life. In 1796, as Europe swirled with change, the young general Napoleon Bonaparte was given a task that many considered impossible: command of the Army of Italy. Poorly equipped and demoralized, the army was on the verge of collapse. But for Napoleon, it was a chance to prove himself, and he took full advantage of it. The Italian campaign, which lasted from 1796 to 1797, was a true triumph for the young commander. Arriving in Nice, Napoleon found his army in a deplorable state. The soldiers suffered from hunger and disease, their uniforms were threadbare, and their pay was extremely late. Napoleon himself, despite his young age of 26, made a lasting impression on them. He was energetic, decisive, and full of ideas. His speeches were inspiring, and his confidence was contagious. Napoleon immediately began reorganizing the army. He established supply lines, providing the soldiers with food and new ammunition. He recruited talented officers such as André Massena and Jean Lannes, who became his loyal allies. His primary tactics were a swift advance, concentration of forces in decisive areas, and exploitation of maneuverability. He knew how to identify the enemy's weak points and deliver precise, devastating blows. The first major victory was the Battle of Mondovi in 1796, where French troops routed the Sardinian army. This victory opened the way to Turenne and forced the Kingdom of Sardinia to sign a humiliating peace treaty. Napoleon then turned his forces against the Austrians, who controlled most of northern Italy. The Battle of Lodi, fought in 1796, was one of the most striking episodes of the campaign. The French army faced superior Austrian forces, but Napoleon personally led his grenadiers in a charge across the bridge under heavy fire. His courage and determination inspired his soldiers, and they managed to capture the city. This victory cemented Napoleon's reputation as an outstanding commander. Over the following months, Napoleon won a series of brilliant victories at Arcole and Rivoli. He managed to defeat the Austrian armies piecemeal, preventing them from uniting. His rapid marches and unexpected maneuvers caught the enemy off guard. The Austrian command, composed of experienced but conservative generals, proved unprepared for this style of warfare. The Italian campaign was not only a military triumph, but also a period of cultural enrichment. Following Napoleon's orders, the French army plundered Italy of works of art, which later adorned French museums, particularly the Louvre. Napoleon himself showed an interest in antiquity and science, recruiting scholars and artists to participate in the expedition. Daily life for soldiers in Italy was difficult. Despite victories, they often experienced food shortages and suffered from diseases such as malaria, which was prevalent in the Po Valley. However, the army's morale was high thanks to their successes and faith in their young general. The soldiers knew they had a man behind them who could lead them to glory and plunder. By 1797, Napoleon effectively controlled all of northern Italy. He founded several republics there, dependent on France, such as the Cisalpine Republic. His successes evoked admiration in France and beyond, and his name became synonymous with victory. The campaign culminated in the Peace of Campo Formio, signed in 1797. Under this treaty, Austria ceded its possessions in the Netherlands to France and recognized the Cisalpine Republic. Napoleon, acting virtually independently, demonstrated his diplomatic skills by concluding a peace on terms favorable to France. The Italian campaign cemented Napoleon's reputation as an invincible commander. He demonstrated that youth and innovative ideas could trump experience and traditional methods. This campaign marked the first step toward his future greatness, the birth of a genius who would change the course of European history. After the brilliant Italian campaign, a new, ambitious undertaking awaited the young General Bonaparte, one that would forever change his fate and the course of history. This was the Egyptian expedition, which began in 1798. The Directory, which ruled France, saw this campaign as an opportunity to weaken Great Britain by cutting off its access to India, as well as an opportunity for Napoleon to prove himself far from home, where his growing popularity could become a threat. Napoleon, always striving for greatness, saw in Egypt an opportunity not only for military glory, but also for scientific discovery. He gathered with him not only an army, but also over 100 scientists, engineers, artists, and other specialists, a veritable institute within the Navy. These men were called upon to explore the ancient civilization, its history, geography, and culture. The fleet, numbering approximately 400 ships, set sail from Toulon in May 1798. The voyage was long and arduous. The soldiers, as in Italy, suffered from seasickness and heat. Conditions on board were cramped, and food supplies could quickly run low. Nevertheless, spirits were lifted by the anticipation of new achievements. The first major objective was the capture of Malta, which occurred without much resistance in June 1798. The fleet then headed for the shores of Egypt. Arriving in Alexandria in early July 1798, the French army encountered local forces known as Mamluks. Soon after landing, the Battle of the Pyramids took place, where Napoleon won a decisive victory. His tactics, based on forming soldiers into squares, proved effective against the Mamluk cavalry. This victory opened the way for the French to Cairo, where Napoleon sought to establish a new order, seeking to win the favor of the local population. He issued proclamations promising to respect the religion and customs of the Egyptians, which was part of his strategy. However, soon after its triumph on land, disaster struck the French fleet. In early August 1798, British Admiral Horatio Nelson discovered and attacked the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay. During the Battle of Aboukir, also known as the Battle of the Nile, almost the entire French fleet was destroyed or captured by the British. This meant that the French army was cut off from supplies and reinforcements from the mother country. Despite this serious setback, Napoleon remained steadfast. He continued his activities in Egypt, devoting considerable attention to scientific research. The scientists who arrived with the expedition began their work. They explored ancient monuments, collected samples of flora and fauna, and studied the language and culture. The result of their work was the publication of the Description of Egypt, a monumental work that revolutionized European Egyptology. It was during this expedition that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, which later played a key role in the decipherment of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Life for soldiers in Egypt was fraught with hardship. The hot climate, unfamiliar food, constant clashes with the local population, and guerrilla warfare created a tense atmosphere. Diseases such as dysentery and plague also claimed lives. However, despite all the hardships, many soldiers were inspired by the opportunity to participate in a great undertaking, witness the wonders of the ancient world, and serve under the command of their idol. In 1799, Napoleon learned of the unfavorable political situation in France. The Directory was losing control, and the country needed a strong man. Realizing that his presence in Egypt was becoming increasingly irrelevant, and seeing an opportunity to return and seize power, Napoleon decided to secretly leave Egypt. In August 1799, leaving command to General Jean-Baptiste Kléber, Napoleon, along with a small group of confidants, sailed back to France. The Egyptian expedition, despite military setbacks such as the loss of his fleet, became a significant milestone in Napoleon's life. It demonstrated his capacity for ambitious planning, scientific curiosity, and adaptability to changing circumstances. The expedition also had a profound impact on European science and culture, revealing the treasures of ancient Egypt to the West. For Napoleon himself, it was merely an interim step before his renewed ascent to power. So we left Napoleon in Egypt, ready for new achievements. His return to France in 1799 was swift and secret. The country, exhausted by years of revolutionary upheaval, needed a strong leader. The Directory, the executive body, was losing its authority, and political instability was growing. Napoleon, returning from Egypt, found himself at the center of this turbulent political life. He wasted no time. His goal was to establish lasting order and consolidate his own power. Together with like-minded associates, including such influential figures as Sieyès, one of the directors, and Talleyrand, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Napoleon began preparing for a coup. The goal was to overthrow the Directory and establish a new government. The coup, known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire, occurred on November 9, 1799, according to the new revolutionary calendar, or 18 Brumaire, year 8 of the Republic. This day became a turning point in French history. Events unfolded rapidly. A meeting of the Council of Elders and the Council of 500, the two chambers of the legislative body, was moved from Paris to St. Cloud under the pretext of a Jacobin conspiracy. Napoleon, as commander-in-chief of the troops, used his position to maintain control. His soldiers surrounded the building where the meetings were taking place. A heated debate erupted in the Council of 500, with many deputies outraged by the military's interference. Napoleon attempted to address them, but his speech was interrupted by shouts and accusations. The situation escalated. At this critical moment, on Napoleon's orders, soldiers under the command of his brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who presided over the Council of 500, entered the hall. They dispersed the deputies, and the coup was successfully completed. The Directory was overthrown. The Directory was replaced by a new government, the Consulate. This was a period when power was effectively concentrated in the hands of the three consuls. However, from the very beginning, it was clear who the true leader was. Napoleon Bonaparte was appointed first consul, Cambacérès second, and Lebrun third. Napoleon, as first consul, wielded the broadest authority. A period of active reforms began. Napoleon understood that profound changes were necessary to stabilize the country. He focused on restoring order, strengthening the economy, and creating a coherent system of governance. One of the first steps was streamlining the financial system. The creation of the Bank of France stabilized the currency and improved tax collection. Napoleon also devoted his attention to legislation. The process of creating a new set of laws, which later became known as the Civil Code or the Napoleonic Code, began during this period. This code became one of Napoleon's most significant achievements, enshrining many principles of the French Revolution, such as the equality of all citizens before the law, property rights, and freedom of contract. It had a profound influence on the legal systems of many countries around the world. Educational reforms were carried out to create a unified system of public schools and lycées. The goal was to cultivate loyal and educated citizens for the new France. An administrative reform was also implemented, strengthening central authority and unifying local governance. Prefectures were created, headed by prefects appointed by the first consul. To reconcile with the Church, which had been greatly weakened during the Revolution, Napoleon concluded the Concordat with Pope Pius VII in 1801. This treaty restored relations between France and the Holy See, recognizing Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French people, but retaining state control over the appointment of bishops. During the consulate, ordinary people's lives gradually returned to a calmer course. After decades of chaos and uncertainty, people looked to Napoleon as a guarantor of stability and order. Trade began to revive, and industry flourished. Although many of the freedoms proclaimed by the Revolution were curtailed, people valued security and predictability. Parisians, weary of political turmoil, found solace in the restoration of traditional festivals and customs. Bustling markets reappeared on city streets, and homes became more comfortable. In 1802, following a plebiscite, Napoleon was declared consul for life. This was another step toward concentrating power in his hands. However, Napoleon's ambitions knew no bounds. He envisioned France not just as a republic, but as an empire capable of dominating Europe. It was during this period, in 1804, that an event occurred that forever changed the political map of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, supported by the Senate and the people, proclaimed himself Emperor of the French. This act marked the end of the First French Republic and the beginning of the First French Empire. Napoleon's coronation took place on December 2, 1804, in Notre Dame Cathedral. It was a grand event, intended to demonstrate the grandeur and power of the new empire. Napoleon crowned himself, and then crowned his wife, Josephine, Empress. This moment symbolized not only his personal power, but also the revival of monarchical traditions in France, albeit in a new imperial form. The consulate, which began with the coup of 18 Brumaire, marked a period of fundamental transformation and the consolidation of Napoleon's power. It paved the way for his subsequent rise and the creation of an empire that would shape the fate of Europe for years to come. It was a time when the genius of the military leader and statesman fully manifested itself, laying the foundations of a new order that, despite all subsequent upheavals, left an indelible mark on history. In 1804, when France, having endured the turbulent years of revolution, was seeking stability, Napoleon Bonaparte, already wielding considerable power, took the next step toward absolute monarchy. He proclaimed himself Emperor of the French. This event, the culmination of his rise, marked the end of the First French Republic and the birth of the First French Empire. The solemn coronation took place on December 2, 1804, in the majestic Notre Dame Cathedral. It was more than a mere ceremonial event, but a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to demonstrate to the world the power and legitimacy of the new empire. Napoleon, seeking to emphasize his independence from ecclesiastical authority, personally took the crown from Pope Pius VII and placed it on his own head. He then crowned his wife, Josephine, Empress. This act symbolized not only his personal greatness, but also the revival of monarchical traditions, albeit in a new imperial form, distinct from the old royal regime. The creation of the empire was not only a personal triumph for Napoleon, but also a reflection of his ambitions to reshape Europe. He saw France as the center of a new, powerful state, capable of establishing order and ensuring prosperity. The imperial title gave him not only prestige, but also legitimacy in the eyes of European monarchs, many of whom were his relatives or allies. The consulate, which began with the coup of 18th Brumaire, was a time of profound transformations that laid the foundation for the future empire. Napoleon distinguished himself as an outstanding statesman, implementing reforms that affected virtually every aspect of French society. One of the most significant reforms was the Civil Code, known as the Napoleonic Code, adopted in 1802. This set of laws unified the French legal system, enshrining many of the Revolution's gains, such as equality before the law, the inviolability of private property, and freedom of contract. The Napoleonic Code had a profound influence on the development of legal systems in many countries around the world, and remains in force in one form or another to this day. Napoleon sought economic stabilization and development. The French Banknote Society was established, playing a key role in restoring the country's financial system and controlling currency circulation. Efforts were made to develop industry and agriculture, and to build roads and canals, all of which contributed to economic growth. In the field of education, Napoleon placed particular emphasis on creating a system of lycées, secondary educational institutions, designed to train future officials, officers, and specialists for the needs of the state. This educational system contributed to the formation of a new elite loyal to the emperor. Church policy also underwent changes. In 1801, a concordat was concluded with the Pope, restoring relations between France and the Catholic Church. This was a compromise that allowed the Church to regain some of its influence while maintaining state control over ecclesiastical affairs. In everyday life, these years brought relative stability to the French after decades of chaos. Cities began to recover and trade revived. However, the lives of ordinary people remained fraught with hardship. Food prices fluctuated and taxes remained a significant burden. Many families still lived in modest circumstances, but the mere ability to plan for the future without fear of sudden upheaval was a significant achievement. Napoleon, as emperor, sought to surround himself with the splendor and luxury befitting his new status. Many court ceremonies and titles were restored, albeit in somewhat modified forms. At Versailles, which had suffered years of neglect, music was once again heard, and balls and receptions were held. The imperial family and the aristocrats close to them displayed a new imperial style. An important aspect of the empire's creation was the development of new state symbols. Eagles became a symbol of imperial power, adorning standards, flags, and military uniforms. The imperial coat of arms, combining elements of the French monarchy and the Roman Empire, was intended to emphasize the continuity and grandeur of the new dynasty. Napoleon understood that his power, based on military force, must be backed by popular support. Therefore, plebiscites, held to approve key political decisions, became an important instrument for legitimizing his authority. Although the results of these votes were often predetermined, they created the appearance of an expression of the people's will. Thus, the period from the consulate to the empire was a time of profound change, when Napoleon Bonaparte, proving himself a brilliant military leader and far-sighted statesman, consolidated power, carried out sweeping reforms, and created a new empire that would shape the course of European history for many years to come. This period demonstrated his ability to combine revolutionary ideas with monarchical traditions, creating a unique political system that continues to evoke admiration and controversy today. In 1805, as autumn was waning, Europe stood in suspense. On the fields of Moravia, not far from the small town of Austerlitz, an event was being prepared that would forever be etched into the annals of history. It was not just a battle, but a clash of three great powers, three emperors, each striving to assert their dominance on the continent. On one side stood France, led by its ambitious leader, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. On the other, an alliance of three monarchies: the Russian Empire under the young and energetic Alexander I, the Austrian Empire, represented by Emperor Francis II, and the Holy Roman Empire, whose name already bore the imprint of a bygone era. Napoleon, recently crowned emperor, was at the height of his power. His battle-hardened army seemed invincible. The emperor himself, possessing a brilliant strategic mind, knew how to inspire his soldiers and anticipate the enemy's every move. His goal was not simply to win, but to crush the coalition and end the threat to his dominance forever. The Allies, on the other hand, were less united. The Russian and Austrian armies, although both possessed significant forces, had different views on tactics and strategy. Emperor Alexander I, young and determined, sought proactive action, while the Austrian command, more cautious, preferred a wait-and-see approach. This disagreement played a role in future events. Napoleon, keenly aware of his enemy's disunity, devised a cunning plan. He deliberately weakened his right flank, creating the appearance of retreat and vulnerability. This was intended to provoke the Allies into a premature attack, drawing their troops out of advantageous positions and opening the way for a decisive blow. He chose a battlefield, hilly terrain, which allowed him to conceal his maneuvers and use the terrain to his advantage. December 2, 1805, dawned frosty and foggy. Thick steam rose from the ground, enveloping the fields of the Austerlitz plain. This fog acted as a kind of natural curtain, concealing troop movements and adding uncertainty to the already tense situation. Napoleon, observing everything from the Pratzen Heights, waited. He knew that his opponents, having fallen for his ruse, would make a mistake. Indeed, the Allies, seeing the French troops seemingly retreating on their right flank, decided to take advantage. They directed their main forces to outflank the French and cut them off from their escape routes. This maneuver, which seemed so successful, in fact led them straight into a trap. As the Allied forces, caught up in the pursuit, pushed deeper into the valley, Napoleon gave the order. His reserves, hidden until then, moved forward swiftly. The main attack was directed at the center of the Allied army, at the Pratzen Heights, which they had just abandoned. The French Guard, elite units, rushed to the assault with cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" The battle raged with unprecedented violence. Artillery on both sides spat fire. Infantry clashed in hand-to-hand combat, and cavalry rushed across the field, leaving the wounded and dead in their wake. But the French onslaught was irresistible. They broke resistance in the center and then began to press the Allies from the flanks. By midday, the fog began to clear, revealing a horrific battlefield. French troops, having completely captured the Pratzen Heights, were now shelling the Allied columns, attempting to break out of the encirclement. Many trapped soldiers drowned in frozen ponds while trying to escape fire and pursuit. It was a tragic but inevitable part of the battle of that time. By evening, the battle was over. The result exceeded Napoleon's wildest expectations. The Russian and Austrian armies were routed. Thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Emperors Alexander and Francis were forced to flee the battlefield, humiliated and defeated. The Battle of Austerlitz, nicknamed the Battle of the Three Emperors, marked the pinnacle of Napoleon's glory. It demonstrated his genius as a commander, his ability to anticipate and control the course of events. This victory consolidated his power, undermined the strength of his opponents, and long-lastingly determined the political map of Europe. For ordinary people living their daily lives far from the battlefields, news of such events arrived late, bringing with it fear, uncertainty, and sometimes even pride in their national successes, if any. The lives of peasants and artisans continued as usual, but the echoes of great battles inevitably reached their humble homes, reminding them how fragile peace can be. Following his triumph at Austerlitz, Napoleon continued to consolidate his position in Europe. His ambitions went beyond mere military superiority. He sought to redraw the political map of the continent, establishing a new order with France at its center. One of the most significant steps in this direction was the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, and consequently, the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, founded in the 10th century, was a complex mosaic of hundreds of states, principalities, duchies, and free cities. It had long since lost its former unity and power, becoming more of a formal association than a real political force. Many German lands were nominally part of the empire, but were effectively governed by their own rulers, often oriented toward outside powers, including France. Napoleon saw this situation as a perfect opportunity to expand his influence. He began actively working with the German princes, offering them favorable terms, support in acquiring new territories, strengthening their sovereignty, and protection from external threats. In exchange, he demanded loyalty, the provision of military contingents, and adherence to his political plans. By 1806, after Austerlitz and the Peace of Pressburg, Napoleon was at the height of his power. It was then, on July 12, 1806, that the treaty establishing the Confederation of the Rhine was signed in Paris. This was a political entity uniting 16 German states, including such important players as Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt. Emperor Napoleon was declared protector of the Confederation. The consequences of this event were colossal. The Confederation of the Rhine effectively meant the secession of most German states from the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a direct attack on its very existence. The Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II of the Habsburg dynasty, ignored the events for a long time, hoping that the situation would resolve itself. However, when it became clear that Napoleon intended to see his end through, Francis II was forced to take decisive action. On August 6, 1806, Francis II abdicated the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. He declared that he could no longer fulfill the duties of emperor, given the dissolution of the Confederation of the Rhine and the impossibility of the empire's continued existence. This event marked the formal end of the 1,000-year history of the Holy Roman Empire, which had been one of the longest-lived political entities in European history. For ordinary people living in the German lands, these changes could be felt in different ways. For some, it meant strengthening the power of the local prince, acquiring new lands, or greater autonomy. For others, especially those attached to old traditions, it could be an alarming signal, foreshadowing uncertainty and the loss of their familiar way of life. Peasants, artisans, and merchants continued to go about their daily business, but news of such monumental political shifts, even if delayed, inevitably impacted their lives, creating an atmosphere of change and new realities. The creation of the Confederation of the Rhine and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire were more than mere legal acts. They represented a profound reshaping of Europe, laying the foundations for future nation-states and altering the balance of power on the continent. Napoleon, while posing as a liberator from feudal fragmentation, in reality sought to create a bloc of states under his control that would serve his interests and strengthen his dominance. This redrawing of the map of Europe became one of the most striking manifestations of his desire to create a new European system based on French hegemony. Napoleon's empire, established on the ruins of the old order, continued its rapid expansion. Following the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, the European political map underwent significant changes. Napoleon, seeking to strengthen his influence and secure France's borders, did not rest on his laurels. His ambitions were far-reaching, and in 1806, one of the oldest and most powerful states in Europe, Prussia, again captured the emperor's attention. The Kingdom of Prussia, once a formidable power, was in a state of some uncertainty. After the death of King Frederick the Great in 1786, Prussia failed to find an equally charismatic and far-sighted leader. King Frederick William II and then his son Frederick William III lacked the same strategic acumen. The Prussian army, renowned for its discipline and training, seemed to have lost its former strength. Its tactics, based on linear battle formations and strict hierarchy, seemed outdated compared to the maneuverable and rapid tactics of the French forces. Napoleon, alert to any sign of weakness, saw Prussia as a potential threat that needed to be neutralized. Events unfolded rapidly. In 1806, under pressure from France, Prussia found itself in a difficult diplomatic situation. The French emperor presented a series of demands that were unacceptable to Prussia. Tension grew, and it soon became clear that a peaceful resolution to the conflict was impossible. In September 1806, the Prussian king, Frederick William III, under the influence of his advisers and public sentiment, declared mobilization. The Prussian army, numbering approximately 160,000 men, began to advance. However, despite its numerical strength, the Prussian command acted slowly and hesitantly. Generals such as Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand, Duke of Brunswick, were veterans of previous wars, but their experience was no match for the new era of the Napoleonic military machine. Napoleon, upon learning of the mobilization, responded immediately. He quickly redeployed his troops from their winter quarters. The French army, known as the Grande Armée, was well trained and motivated. It consisted of experienced soldiers who had served in numerous campaigns and was commanded by talented marshals such as Louis-Nicolas Davout, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, and Michel Ney. The decisive battle took place in mid-October 1806. Napoleon chose the terrain between the cities of Jena and Auerstedt, located in the modern German state of Thuringia. The two cities were approximately 10 kilometers apart, and the events that unfolded that day forever entered military history. The Battle of Jena, fought on October 14th, was the first act of this monumental battle. Napoleon personally led the French forces, numbering approximately 50,000. Opposing him was the Prussian army under the Duke of Brunswick, numbering approximately 38,000. The French, employing their traditional tactics, attacked swiftly. Napoleon's artillery, skillfully maneuvering, dealt devastating blows to the Prussian positions. The infantry and cavalry acted in concert, breaking through the enemy's defenses. The Duke of Brunswick, attempting to organize resistance, was wounded early in the battle. His death was a serious blow to the Prussian army. The French troops, buoyed by their success, steadily advanced. By midday, the Prussian army was routed. About 10,000 Prussian soldiers were killed or wounded, and another 15,000 were captured. The French suffered relatively light losses. At the same time, near Jena, near the town of Auerstedt, events were unfolding that would only exacerbate the disaster for Prussia. The bulk of the Prussian army, numbering approximately 60,000 men, under the command of General von Mellendorf, was stationed in the Auerstedt area. Their mission was to support the forces of the Duke of Brunswick. However, due to poor coordination and miscommunication between the commanders, they were unable to provide timely assistance. A French corps under Marshal Davout, numbering only about 26,000 men, found itself caught between two Prussian armies. Despite the enemy's significant numerical superiority, Marshal Davout decided to accept battle. He took up a favorable defensive position and steadfastly withstood the Prussian attacks. The French soldiers, inspired by their marshal's example, fought with incredible courage. They skillfully exploited the terrain, and their artillery, despite its inferior numbers, proved highly effective. The Prussian generals, unable to organize a unified offensive, acted disorganized. Their attacks were repelled with heavy losses. By evening, the Prussian army at Auerstedt was also routed. Prussian losses amounted to approximately 20,000 men, including killed, wounded, and captured. The French troops, despite suffering losses, were able to hold their positions and achieve victory. The Battle of Jena-Auerstedt was one of the most crushing defeats in Prussian history. In a single day, an army considered one of the finest in Europe was virtually annihilated. This event had far-reaching consequences. Prussia found itself completely defenseless against the advancing French troops. Napoleon entered Berlin, the Prussian capital, unopposed at the end of October 1806. For ordinary people living in Prussia, these events came as a shock. For centuries, the Prussian army had been a symbol of strength and order. Now, it seemed, everything had collapsed overnight. Confusion and fear reigned in the cities. Many families awaited news from their sons and husbands serving in the army, and this news often brought grief. Craftsmen, merchants, and farmers continued their daily work, but a sense of uncertainty hung in the air. The French soldiers occupying the country behaved in varying ways. Some were disciplined, while others indulged in looting and violence, further fueling fear and hatred of the occupiers. Napoleon's victory over Prussia not only strengthened his hold on Europe, but also marked a crucial stage in the redrawing of the continent's political map. It demonstrated the superiority of French military organization and tactics over outdated systems. This event also spurred further changes in Europe, laying the foundations for future conflicts and transformations. By crushing the old Prussian might, Napoleon opened a new chapter in the continent's history, a chapter full of change and unpredictable twists. After the crushing defeat of Prussia, when the old military might seemed broken, Napoleon turned his attention to a new, no less significant front, the economic. This was an era when wars were fought not only on the battlefield, but also in ports, markets, and in people's minds. Napoleon, seeking to weaken his main adversary, Great Britain, decided to use a weapon against it that he hoped would prove no less effective than cannons and sabers. This weapon became known as the Continental Blockade. The idea behind the blockade was to completely close European ports to British goods. Napoleon issued a decree in Berlin in November 1806, prohibiting all territories under his control, as well as Allied states, from trading with Great Britain. The goal was simple: deprive Britain of its markets, undermine its economy, and force it to accept peace terms. Great Britain, an island nation, relied heavily on its maritime trade and industrial exports. Napoleon hoped that by cutting it off from continental Europe, he could deal it a fatal blow. The imposition of the Continental Blockade was a massive and complex undertaking. It required the efforts and cooperation of numerous countries, many of which were forced to submit to the will of the French emperor. Inspections of ships began in port cities such as Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Antwerp. French officials and soldiers ensured that no British goods, even those transported on neutral ships, reached the continent. Confiscation of goods became commonplace. The effects of the blockade on ordinary people were quite noticeable. Countries where trade with Britain was a vital part of the economy began to experience difficulties. For example, the Russian Empire, which was forced to join the blockade at the time, experienced shortages of many common goods. British colonial goods such as sugar, coffee, and cotton became rare and expensive. This caused discontent among the merchants and nobility accustomed to comfort. However, ordinary people also felt these changes, as even the most basic fabrics, previously affordable, were now becoming a luxury. The Continental Blockade also posed a serious challenge for the British. Their industries, particularly textiles, faced a decline in exports. But the British found a solution. They began actively seeking new markets in South America and other parts of the world. Furthermore, the British Navy, dominating the seas, began retaliating. They began intercepting French and neutral ships attempting to trade with the continent and confiscating their cargo. The British also began smuggling goods to the European continent, which undermined the effectiveness of the blockade. Napoleon, seeing that the blockade was not producing the desired results, increased the pressure. He expanded French-controlled territory to control as many ports as possible. This led to new conflicts and wars. For example, the Portuguese king's attempt to refuse to join the blockade was one of the reasons for the French invasion of Portugal in 1807. This invasion subsequently escalated into a long and grueling war in Spain known as the Spanish Ulcer, and became one of Napoleon's most difficult trials. The Continental Blockade, intended as a means of weakening Great Britain, ultimately had far-reaching and often unforeseen consequences for France itself and its allies. It led to rising prices, shortages, and economic hardship in many European countries. Resentment against French domination grew. Smuggling flourished, undermining Napoleon's efforts. Paradoxically, the blockade, designed to isolate Great Britain, to some extent contributed to the development of its own economy and the strengthening of its maritime power, as the British were forced to seek new routes for their trade and production. Napoleon himself, despite all his efforts, was unable to completely seal off Europe from British goods. Smuggling, a shadowy but vital artery, continued to supply the continent with essential goods. Wealthy merchants and aristocrats, unwilling to give up their accustomed comforts, paid high prices for British fabrics, sugar, and other delicacies. For ordinary people, the blockade meant rising prices for many essential goods, which caused latent and sometimes overt discontent. The economic war unleashed by Napoleon was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. It demonstrated that military force was not always capable of solving economic problems. The idea of completely closing the continent to British trade proved too ambitious and difficult to implement. The Continental Blockade ultimately became one of the factors contributing to the weakening of the Napoleonic Empire, although not the most direct one. It generated new conflicts, exacerbated economic difficulties, and fueled general dissatisfaction with French domination, setting the stage for future events, such as the fateful campaign in Russia. The end of the Continental Blockade seemed to herald new trials for the Napoleonic Empire. Instead of strengthening France's position, the attempt to isolate Great Britain sparked new conflicts and exacerbated economic difficulties, fueling resentment against French domination. It was in this atmosphere of tension and latent resistance that one of Napoleon's most grueling campaigns unfolded, the Spanish War, which would last from 1808 to 1814. Spain, once an ally of France, found itself drawn into the orbit of Napoleon's ambitions. In 1808, under the pretext of preparing to invade Portugal, French troops entered the Iberian Peninsula. Napoleon, wishing to consolidate his influence, forced the Spanish King Charles IV to abdicate in favor of his son, Ferdinand VII, and then, manipulating both, forced them both to renounce their rights to the Spanish crown. Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, was placed on the throne. However, this move provoked fierce resistance from the Spanish people. The Spaniards, deeply religious and proud, could not accept a foreign protégé on the throne or the invasion of their country. In response to these events, popular uprisings broke out across Spain. It was here, on Spanish soil, that the French army encountered a new, unprecedented type of warfare. The term guerrilla, a diminutive of guerra meaning war, became a symbol of this unique resistance. The guerrillas, often composed of peasants, priests, and ordinary townspeople, operated in small, mobile groups. They avoided direct clashes with large, well-trained French units, preferring surprise attacks, ambushes, sabotaging communications, and the destruction of small garrisons. The war was grueling and bloody. French troops, accustomed to fighting on the open fields of Europe, found themselves in unfamiliar surroundings. Mountain passes, the narrow streets of Spanish towns, and dense forests all became arenas for guerrilla warfare. The guerrillas knew the terrain, had the support of the population, and responded with unprecedented brutality to French repression. Any attempt by the French to establish order was punished with particular cruelty, which only fueled hatred and the desire to resist. Daily life for the Spanish during this period was filled with fear and deprivation. Villages and towns often found themselves caught between French troops and guerrilla forces. Food was scarce. Trade was disrupted. Many people were forced to flee their homes, becoming refugees. The French army, in turn, suffered a constant supply shortage. Guerrillas cut roads, destroyed supply trains, and French soldiers were forced to live in constant tension, expecting an attack from the shadows. This war was dubbed the Spanish Plague, not only because of its protracted nature, but also because of the way it drained Napoleon's army. A large number of French troops were diverted to suppressing uprisings and fighting guerrillas, weakening Napoleon's forces on other fronts. The French army suffered enormous losses, not only from direct clashes, but also from disease, hunger, and harsh living conditions. Key figures in this war included French commanders like Marshal Soult and Marshal Massena, who tried to restore order and suppress resistance, as well as Spanish leaders like General Palafox, who defended Zaragoza, and figures who became symbols of the partisan movement. However, unlike regular armies, partisan commanders were often local heroes, known only within their own regions. A crucial factor was the support Spain received from Great Britain. British troops under the Duke of Wellington landed on the Iberian Peninsula, fighting alongside Spanish guerrillas and regular troops. This created a second front against Napoleon, which required significant resources and attention. The Spanish War, which began as an attempt to establish a new order, turned into a protracted conflict that became one of Napoleon's most significant miscalculations. It demonstrated that even the most powerful army could prove powerless in the face of popular resistance and guerrilla tactics. The Spanish Plague slowly but surely sapped the empire's strength, diverting resources and undermining Napoleon's prestige, paving the way for future catastrophes. It was during this period, when the Spanish War was draining the empire's resources, that Napoleon made a decision that would later become one of the most fateful of his career. This was the campaign against Russia, which began in 1812. This undertaking, intended as a show of force and the final subjugation of Russia, turned into a disaster, ushering in the irreversible decline of the Napoleonic Empire. The reasons that prompted Napoleon to take this step were multifaceted. Chief among them was Russia's reluctance to fully comply with the terms of the continental blockade imposed on Great Britain. Russian trade with England, albeit limited, continued, undermining Napoleon's economic war. Furthermore, in 1811, Russia concluded a trade treaty with Sweden and also revised the terms of its membership in the Continental Blockade, which Napoleon perceived as a direct violation of the agreement. The French emperor saw this as a challenge to his authority and a threat to the European order he sought to establish. The assembly of the Grande Armée, as it was called, began in the spring of 1812. It was a truly grandiose gathering of troops, numbering over 600,000 men. It included representatives of the most diverse peoples of Europe: French, Poles, Italians, Germans, Austrians, Spaniards, Dutch, and many others. Such multinationality was typical of Napoleon's armies, but this time it also carried hidden risks. Not all soldiers were equally motivated, and the language barrier often hampered communication. The Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River, the border of the Russian Empire, in mid-June 1812. Napoleon's initial plan was for a swift and decisive offensive to force the Russian Emperor Alexander I to negotiate on France's terms. However, the Russian command, led by General Barclay de Tolly and later Prince Kutuzov, chose a tactic of avoiding a decisive battle. The Russian army retreated, stretching the enemy's lines of communication and wearing them down. As the Grande Armée advanced deeper into Russia, the soldiers' living conditions became increasingly harsh. Summers in Russia proved scorching, and roads, often unpaved, turned into dusty or muddy lanes depending on the weather. Food supplies, unable to be transported quickly due to the vast distances and poor infrastructure, began to run low. Soldiers suffered from hunger, thirst, and diseases such as dysentery and typhus. Daily life on the march was full of hardships. In the morning, as soon as dawn broke, the soldiers were already on the move. Setting up camp in the evening was a difficult task, especially when water and fuel for fires had to be found. Food consisted mainly of crackers, salted meat, and meager porridge, if grain was available. Napoleon, accustomed to swift and victorious campaigns, encountered unprecedented resistance. Russian peasants, seeing their lands devastated, often retreated into the forests, carrying away everything of value and burning what they couldn't carry. This deprived the French army of the ability to forage, that is, to obtain food locally. Guerrilla warfare, though not on the same scale as in Spain, also began to gain momentum. The key moment was the Battle of Borodino, which took place in early September 1812. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the time. The French army suffered heavy losses, but achieved a tactical victory by occupying the battlefield. However, the Russian army, although in retreat, retained its fighting capacity. After Borodino, the Russian command decided to abandon Moscow without a fight in order to preserve its army. The Grand Army's entry into Moscow in mid-September 1812 presented a new challenge. The city, abandoned by most of its population, was engulfed in fires, which, according to various accounts, were either accidental or deliberately set by the Russians. These fires destroyed a significant portion of the supplies that could have been useful to the French army. Napoleon, expecting the Russian emperor's capitulation, found himself in a desperate situation. The wait in devastated Moscow dragged on. Napoleon awaited Alexander I's envoys, but they never arrived. Time passed, cold weather approached, and it became clear that further presence in Russia without adequate supplies was impossible. In mid-October 1812, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. The return journey became a true nightmare. The Grande Armée, weakened by hunger, disease, and constant skirmishes with pursuing Russian troops and Cossacks, was melting away before our eyes. The weather deteriorated sharply, and the first frost struck. Soldiers dressed in summer uniforms suffered from the cold. Supplies virtually ceased. Thousands died from frostbite, hunger, and disease. The Berezina River became the last line of defense, which the French managed to cross with great difficulty, leaving behind a huge number of men and equipment. By the end of 1812, virtually nothing remained of the Grande Armée. Fewer than 100,000 men, only a fraction of whom were combat-ready, managed to return to Polish territory. The campaign in Russia marked a fateful turning point, undermining Napoleon's military might and spurring the formation of a new anti-French coalition. This event demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful army in the face of vast expanses, harsh climates, and stubborn popular resistance. The campaign in Russia, which led to the crushing defeat of the Grande Armée, marked a turning point. Napoleon's hopes for a rapid recovery and the return of his former influence were eroded with each passing day. The European powers, seeing the weakening of French power, once again united against the emperor. A new, sixth anti-French coalition formed, comprising Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and Great Britain. This united force was ready to wage a decisive battle. Despite his losses, Napoleon managed to assemble a new army. However, these were no longer the seasoned veterans who had fought in previous campaigns. Young soldiers, many barely out of age, swelled the ranks. They were full of patriotic fervor, but lacking seasonedness and combat experience. The emperor realized he faced superior forces and sought to avoid a decisive battle until he could muster sufficient troops. The campaign of 1813 is often called the Battle of the Nations. This name reflects the scale and composition of the opposing armies. This time, Napoleon faced not only Russian and Prussian forces, but also an Austrian army under Archduke Charles, and Swedish corps led by Napoleon's former Marshal Bernadotte. The battle that culminated this campaign took place near Leipzig, a city in Saxony. The battle began on October 27, 1813, and lasted for several days. The sky over Leipzig was clouded with smoke from hundreds of cannons. The ground shook with the clatter of thousands of horses and the march of soldiers. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon commanded the French army, which, according to various estimates, numbered around 190,000 men. Opposing him stood the combined Allied army, numbering over 450,000 soldiers. In the first days of the battle, the French managed to hold back the Allied onslaught. Napoleon demonstrated his skill as a commander, maneuvering his troops and trying to find a weak spot in the enemy's defenses. However, the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies and their determination took their toll. During the fierce fighting, the French army suffered enormous losses. The situation became especially dire for the French when Austrian and Swedish troops appeared on the battlefield. October 19, 1813, marked the decisive Allied offensive. The French army, exhausted and demoralized, was forced to retreat. The retreat turned into a rout. Many French soldiers, surrounded, were forced to surrender. The unsuccessful retreat across the Elster River resulted in the deaths of thousands of soldiers who ended up in the water after sappers, hastily blowing up bridges, did so prematurely. The Battle of the Nations at Leipzig was a crushing defeat for Napoleon. His army was virtually destroyed. The emperor, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, made a difficult decision. On October 21, 1813, he ordered a retreat from Germany. This defeat marked the end of Napoleon's dominance on the continent. Following the Battle of Leipzig, the Allies launched an offensive into France. In March 1814, Allied forces entered Paris. Emperor Napoleon, completely isolated, realized that further resistance was futile. On April 6, 1814, he abdicated. This marked the end of the First French Empire. Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean. He was allowed to retain the title of emperor and a small personal guard. France entered the Bourbon Restoration, with Louis XVIII, brother of the executed King Louis XVI, returning to the throne. It seemed the Napoleonic era had become a thing of the past forever. The lives of ordinary people during this period were fraught with hardship. Napoleon's wars exhausted the country. Resources were diverted to military needs, which affected the economy and the well-being of the population. Many families lost their breadwinners on the battlefield. Peasants, artisans, and merchants all felt the consequences of prolonged conflict. Everyday life was focused on survival, providing food and shelter for themselves and their loved ones. News of military actions and political changes reached them late, often distorted. People lived in hope for peace and stability, for the return of their sons and husbands home. Following the defeat at Leipzig and Napoleon's abdication, Europe began to reshape its political landscape. The Congress of Vienna, which began in September 1814, brought together representatives of all European states to define a new order. The primary objective was to restore the balance of power and prevent future conflicts. The Congress was dominated by an atmosphere of diplomatic intrigue, balls, and gala receptions. Representatives of the leading powers, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Great Britain, played a key role in the decision-making process. They sought to restore borders to the pre-Napoleonic wars and restore legitimate monarchies. However, despite this desire to return to the past, the era of change initiated by the French Revolution and continued by Napoleon had already irreversibly altered Europe. The principles of nationalism and liberalism that had emerged during this period continued to smolder beneath the surface of the restored monarchies, ready to erupt again. Napoleon, on the island of Elba, did not lose hope. He closely followed events in France and Europe. Rumors of discontent with the Bourbon Restoration and the unpopularity of the new king and his government reached him. A sense of injustice and a thirst to regain lost power fueled his resolve. While the Congress of Vienna continued its work, Napoleon prepared his final, desperate move. On the island of Elba, where Napoleon Bonaparte was in exile, time flowed differently than in turbulent Europe. It was a time of reflection, but not of oblivion. Rumors, like a gentle breeze, carried echoes of events unfolding on the continent. The Congress of Vienna, which began in September 1814, brought together representatives from all European states. Its goal was to restore the balance of power and define a new political order after the long years of Napoleonic wars. An atmosphere of diplomatic intrigue, balls, and gala receptions reigned in Vienna. Representatives of the leading powers, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Great Britain, played a key role in decision-making. They sought to restore borders to the state that existed before Napoleon's conquests and restore legitimate monarchies. However, despite this desire to return to the past, the era of change initiated by the French Revolution and continued by Napoleon had already irreversibly transformed Europe. The principles of nationalism and liberalism that had emerged during this period continued to smolder beneath the surface of the restored monarchies, ready to erupt again. Napoleon, on the island of Elba, did not lose hope. He closely followed events in France and Europe. Rumors of discontent with the Bourbon Restoration and the unpopularity of the new king, Louis XVIII, and his government reached him. A sense of injustice and a thirst to regain lost power fueled his resolve. While the Congress of Vienna continued its work, Napoleon prepared his final, desperate move. In February 1815, as winter began to give way to spring, Napoleon secretly left Elba. He sailed with a small flotilla of several ships and landed in the south of France at Bay 1. This was the beginning of his famous 100 Days. The French people, tired of the return of the old order and dissatisfied with the policies of the Bourbons, greeted their former emperor with enthusiasm. Soldiers sent to arrest him defected to his side. The army, which had been disbanded, began to rally around him. Napoleon's journey from Rouen to Paris was a triumphal march. He passed through towns and villages and was greeted everywhere as a hero. He did not shed a drop of blood to regain power. His return was seen by many as a symbol of hope for the restoration of France's glory and stability. When Napoleon arrived in Paris, Louis XVIII fled the capital. The emperor reoccupied the Tuileries. It was a remarkable return, one that had seemed impossible just a few months earlier. However, Napoleon's return caused serious concern in Europe. The powers gathered at the Congress of Vienna immediately united against him. They declared Napoleon an outlaw and began raising their armies. Napoleon understood that his time was short. He knew he would have to fight against a united Europe. His primary goal was to defeat the enemy armies piecemeal before they could unite. He assembled a new army composed of soldiers and officers loyal to him. It was an army full of determination and fighting spirit. In June 1815, Napoleon marched north to meet the British and Prussian forces stationed in Belgium. He hoped to defeat them before the Austrian and Russian armies could join them. The Battle of Waterloo, which took place on June 18th, 1815, was the culmination of this final campaign. It was one of the most famous battles in history. Napoleon commanded the French army, while the British forces were led by the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian forces by Field Marshal Blücher. The battle was intense and bloody. The French army fought bravely, but the British and Prussian forces were well organized and determined. By the end of the day, when the Prussian troops under Blücher arrived on the battlefield, the tide had turned. The French army was routed. Napoleon, realizing the battle was lost, was forced to flee. He knew his reign was over. It was a final defeat. After Waterloo, Napoleon surrendered to the British. He was exiled to the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena. There he spent the last years of his life dictating his memoirs and reflecting on his past. He died on May 5, 1821. The Napoleonic era, so vibrant and turbulent, has come to an end. However, his influence on the course of European and world history proved enormous and enduring. He left behind not only destruction and war, but also ideas that continued to live and develop. The reforms he instituted in law, government, and education formed the foundation of many modern institutions. His code, known as the Napoleonic Civil Code, still forms the basis of the legal systems of many countries. The ideas of equality, liberty, and fraternity that formed the foundation of the French Revolution and developed under Napoleon continued to inspire generations. Despite his authoritarian regime and military ambitions, Napoleon became a symbol of change and progress for many. His name is forever etched in history as an example of a brilliant military leader, statesman, and a man who, a child of his time, managed to change the course of history. His legacy, complex and controversial, continues to spark debate and research, reminding us how one man can influence the fate of an entire continent and leave an indelible mark on humanity. An era that began with a whirlwind of change and ended on a remote island left a deep mark on the fabric of history. Napoleon Bonaparte, whose life was as fast and eventful as a swift river, became a symbol not only of great achievements, but also of profound transformations. His legacy is not only a series of military victories and defeats, but also the foundation upon which new societies were built. After his fall, when the last echoes of battle faded and the age of empires began to give way to a new world order, it became clear that Napoleon's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. His activities, spanning vast swaths of Europe, led to a rethinking of political boundaries and administrative structures. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for centuries, gave way to the Confederation of the Rhine, a striking example of the redrawing of the continent's map. However, the true depth of its influence is revealed in the changes it brought to everyday life and the legal system. The Civil Code, known throughout the world as the Napoleonic Code, embodied the ideas of equality before the law, the protection of private property, and freedom of contract. Created to organize and unify French law, this document proved so robust and universal that it formed the foundation of the legal systems of many countries whose development followed the path of modernization and progress. It brought clarity and order to a place where chaos reigned, and its principles continue to guide lawyers and legislators to this day. In addition to legal reforms, Napoleon devoted considerable attention to the development of education and public administration. The establishment of lycées, the streamlining of the educational system, and the formation of an effective administrative apparatus all contributed to the strengthening of the state and the emergence of a new class of citizens, educated and committed to the ideas of progress. These reforms, laid out during the Consulate and Empire periods, became the foundation for France's subsequent development and influenced many European countries seeking to modernize their institutions. The ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, found their reflection in Napoleon's actions, albeit through the lens of his authoritarian rule. He was able to translate these ideas into practice, spreading them throughout Europe along with his conquests. Even in regions where his rule was temporary, these principles left their mark, stimulating national consciousness and a desire for reform. Napoleon has become a figure shrouded in myth and legend. For some, he is a brilliant military leader who changed the course of history. For others, a tyrant who brought war and destruction to Europe. However, if we set aside the controversies and contradictions, a calmer and more stable picture emerges. He was a man of his time, embodying the aspirations and challenges of the era. His life exemplifies how one man, possessing extraordinary abilities and ambitions, can have a colossal impact on the fate of an entire continent. His legacy is not so much the sum of military campaigns as it is a collection of ideas and institutions that continue to live and evolve. It is a reminder that history is an ongoing process where every step, every decision, even the most controversial, contributes to the overall picture. By studying the past, we gain a better understanding of the present and look to the future with confidence. Napoleon's journey from Corsican youth to Emperor of France was full of dramatic twists and turns, but it ended not with the apogee of power, but with solitude and reflection. However, even in isolation, his influence continued to be felt. His code, his administrative reforms, his role in spreading the ideas of the Enlightenment, all of this became part of what we now call the modern world. The Napoleonic era, so vibrant and turbulent, had come to an end. However, his influence on the course of European and world history proved enormous and enduring. He left behind not only destruction and war, but also ideas that continued to live and develop. The reforms he instituted in law, government, and education formed the foundation of many modern institutions. His code, known as the Napoleonic Civil Code, still forms the basis of the legal systems of many countries. The ideas of equality, liberty, and fraternity, which formed the foundation of the French Revolution and developed under Napoleon, continued to inspire generations. Despite his authoritarian regime and military ambitions, Napoleon became a symbol of change and progress for many. His name is forever etched in history as an example of a brilliant military leader, statesman, and a man who, a child of his time, managed to change the course of history. His legacy, complex and controversial, continues to spark debate and research, reminding us how one man can influence the fate of an entire continent and leave an indelible mark on humanity. Now that we've traveled the long road from revolutionary upheaval to imperial grandeur and subsequent decline, it's important to pause and feel a sense of calm. History, like a great river, flows forward, carrying with it the memory of the past. Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the most striking and influential figures on this river, left an indelible mark. His deeds, his ambitions, his genius, all of this has become part of our shared past, shaping our present. We can confidently say that the Napoleonic era was a time of profound change. His reforms in law, administration, and education laid the foundation for many modern institutions. The Civil Code, or Napoleonic Code, became a model for legislation in many countries, bringing with it the principles of equality before the law and the protection of individual rights. These ideas, born in the crucible of the French Revolution, were further developed and disseminated thanks to his work. His influence extended far beyond France. The redrawing of the map of Europe, the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, all were the result of his strategic decisions. Even in those regions where his rule was temporary, he left his mark in the form of new administrative structures and laws that fostered modernization and progress. Napoleon demonstrated how one man, possessing a remarkable intellect and a strong will, can change the course of history. He was a product of his time, yet he shaped it, infusing it with his own ideas and ambitions. His legacy is not merely architectural monuments or military memoirs, but also the invisible threads that connect the past to the present. Now, as we conclude our journey through the Napoleonic era, let us embrace a sense of calm and peace. History, like a wise teacher, teaches us lessons that help us better understand the world. Napoleon's legacy, complex and multifaceted, is an integral part of this teaching. It reminds us of the strength of the human spirit, the possibility of change, and the importance of striving for progress while maintaining wisdom and calm. Let this story be a source of inspiration and peace for you, reminding you that even in the most turbulent times, there is always room for order, reason, and creativity.